Hello, and welcome to the first video in my series on my Build It Bootstrap project. I am Sophie Dickens. This project was initially built for the final project for the Prominio Tech Front-End Web Development Bootcamp, and I will continue working on it to build my portfolio page for several of my future projects. This is a web page, web app built on React, React Router, React Bootstrap, and Axios for its API usage. But let's go ahead and dive in on setup and running. So we've already cloned the repository up here. If you want to clone it for yourself, go to that address for GitHub, github.com/voidifperceived/builditbootstrap.git. You can clone it from there. You are then going to want to navigate to the Build It Bootstrap all first letter capitalized of every word, and you're going to want to navigate to that folder. Wherever you cloned that, it'll be one deeper than the initial folder you cloned it into. And then you're going to want to hit npm install to install all of the dependencies for Build It Bootstrap. That'll install React, React Router, React Bootstrap, and Axios. I am pretty sure I also have jQuery in there, but I never ended up using that. So that'll be something that I probably take out in a future update unless I need it for something. Now that we have npm installed, and we've installed our dependencies, we're going to hit npm start to run our web app. That'll open a new web page. As we wait for this to boot up, there we go. This is the current home page. Each of the elements on the home page has its own editor right now, and I'm hoping to change that, and I will get to that in the next video that I do on this website. But we have the ability here to add new elements, edit the elements that are selected here, and delete elements on the page. So if we want to go into a demonstration here, we have 4 different types of addable components right now. We have a title component, we have a button component, we have a text component, and we have an image component. I'll get to the button and the image components later when we move to our about page. But I'll go ahead and show off that we can in fact add content. I'll start with a title, and I'm going to type in the text, adding title component to web page. We're going to go ahead and add new element. Adding new title component to new web page. Must have refreshed it too quickly. Go ahead and add the component and then refresh it, and there we go. We now have a new title on our web page, and we can also edit this title. So if we don't want this to be a title, we want this to be text instead, we can say, never mind, changed it to text, And we can right now either hit add new element or edit selected elements. I will be removing the add new element from the elements within the rendered page and just sticking with edit selected element and delete. But if we hit edit selected element and we refresh the page, you'll now see that this is now a text element instead of a title element like it was before. As I said, this is all built with Bootstrap, so this is a Bootstrap nav bar. React Router is what I'm using to get this working. We'll now move to the About page, and as you can see, we have an image here and a button that leads to React Bootstrap's button documents. I'll talk more about what is in the back end of the image element in a little bit when we get to the mock API portion of the application. But it is mostly just this link right here. There's also, like I said, the React, I have a React button element that you can add in there. There will be at some point functionality to where you can add a small subsection of subfunctions for that button. Maybe even something like an on submit for that particular website, so we can build up custom forms. That's a goal of mine as well. But you can add the text and the link to what you want to link that button to right now. And if we go ahead and click on that button, you can see we get taken to the React Bootstrap documentation for buttons, just like it says. And like we do on the other page, on the home page, we also have a add new element form down here. Now that we have gone through, well, that's an interesting error. Alright. Fix the error there. Let's see. Okay. Now that we are done with the web page itself, let's go ahead and move over to the actual development of it. Let's start at the top and work our way down. So we have at start is index.js. I have updated from the original assignment, which is the React boilerplate from 2023. I have updated those dependencies to the latest React dependency. As of the recording of this video, the most recent stable version of React and React DOM are 19, React v 19.0.0, and I have updated this application to use both React Router and React DOM 19.0.0. The original, back in 2023, when this initial project was made, was React and React DOM version 17, as well as React Router version 5.2.1, I believe, and now it is 6.3.1, ready to be updated to version 7 React Router. But that'll be in the next video, most likely. If not, then the one after that. So, we have our components, and we have our REST component for accessing the API, and then we have the app.js and the index.js. Let's start with the index.js. That is just the generic React DOM render of the root of app.js. We have our imports up here, classic React index.js application start file. If we move to our app.js, hi cat, if we move to our app.js, this is where the actual meat of the application starts. So we have our imports up here as usual, and this is a class component, which I will probably in the next update of this application refactor to a functional component, since that seems to be what React is moving towards as it slowly inches forward in its development. Latest v19 documentation actually recommends that you migrate class components to functional components. And that is probably what I'm going to spend most of the next update doing. We initialize our state up here. Nothing too extraordinary. And then we have a couple key functions here. We have our fetch users. Pretty much all of these are asynchronous functions because of the nature of our API calls and our Axios calls. So we have an async handle update. This is an update function that is going to be passed down to the children of app.js. It awaits this .fetch users, which if we move down to fetch users is another asynchronous function. And in that function we try we have a try. We set a new constant of users within fetch users to the response of the promise of await protocol manager.get, which we'll get to in a minute. Pun not intended. And then we set the state of users, this array up here, to users, this constant that's down here, and we set is loading is false, just to specify that we are done loading information. And on the bottom half of our try we have a catch error, which just console.logs out the error for when get is called with an error from protocol manager. We then have our asynchronous component did mount function, where we console.log component did mount and we await this .fetch users. Pretty much exactly the same as handle update, but it just takes place at the start when the component is initially rendered. We then have a component did update, is another asynchronous function, and this one is a check. So we check when it updates, is the previous users is the previous state of users different or equal to the current state of users. And if it is different, then we go ahead and fetch users. And if it is the same, we don't do anything, we just silently disregard the component did update function. This looks like to most people that it would be recursive, but because of this null, it actually isn't recursive. That null is the whole reason why this function does not keep updating and updating and updating and updating over and over and over again every single time the update is called. And then lastly, at the bottom of app.js, we have our render function, which we go ahead and call the render and just check what the state is in a console log. If we have is loading state, we return the div true. So I believe if we refresh, you can see it up in the top left corner. You see it flash for a second that it's loading. We then return a new div with the site viewer component. We pass in users as this.state.users, index as this.state.index, and update as this.handleUpdate. This update will be passed down all the way to our user site editor component page. Now that we're done with app.js, let's go ahead and move to Protocol Manager. That is the next most important file in this site. We go ahead and link to our Build It Bootstrap AI after we call the class, and then we assign our functions. So we have the get, the post, the put, and the delete. The post, put, and delete are theoreticals mostly. I think the put function is the only one that's actually used throughout the process. We don't use post and we don't use delete. I believe for deleting objects we just put an array with one less at the index of whatever file or component gets deleted. So we will take a look at that when we get to user site editor. But the basis for this is the get function is an asynchronous function. It takes the endpoint that we're looking for, and right now for most cases we're going to be looking at the index of 0. That is pretty much the lowest you can go, the most specific you can go on mock API /users. So we await an Axios get where we look at users and then the endpoint, and then we console log the response data just to make sure we are in fact getting the data from the response, and then we return and await on the data from that response. And if there's an error, we go ahead and catch that in console.log it at the bottom. Put is exactly the same. We just take an input, which is the new parameter that we're putting in there, and we tack that onto the end as an Axios additive function. So this is an Axios parameter for the .put command for Axios. And other than that, it is pretty much exactly the same as the get command, or the get method. We'll now move on to, I believe next is siteviewer.js. And now is when we have some branching paths. So siteviewer is another class component. And we just go ahead and set the current page slug, which is also known as the end tag for the URL. We go ahead and set that current page slug in the state so that we can change that. in our render function, we go ahead and extrapolate the props into users, index, and update. Update being that function from app.js, which allows the fetch again. And then we go ahead and subdivide that down into site info, being if users exists and has an index exists, then we do users index as site info, and if it doesn't, it just returns an empty array. For constant pages, we have siteinfo.sitepages, which we'll see more in the API at the very end on how the data structure is broken down. But site pages gets variable-ified here. And if it doesn't, it's just set as an empty array. Same with brand, and that is specifically used for this little tag right up here, which takes you to Bootstrap Home. Build a Bootstrap's home page. And then if basically if there's not a page, we return a loading screen right here in the render. And then after that, we return when we have a page length, we return a container with a navbar, the page router, and the page search bar, which we do not have functioning yet, but that is going to be in the next update, in a subsequent update for this website. We'll then move on to, I think now is a good time to go to navbar and router. We'll start with navbar. Navbar is mostly, it's mostly for vanity, just to make it nice and clean, look pretty. Here is where that navbar brand goes. Into here, we just link it directly to the /home page. We sticky the navbar to the top, and then we have a container with a map function that maps the page and index of pages into a new nav element with page and index. Now let's look at the new nav element function. It takes a page and an index. It lets the path to that page be a / with the page's page slug at the end. So let's say that's the page slug is about. For here, it'd be /about at the end, right here. That'll be very important when we move to our page router in just a minute. And at the end, we return a new nav item with a nav link. We key that nav item to an index, and we set the href to path, which just links it to whatever that path is. And we set the page name up here, and we page it to uppercase. And if there is no pages, we just say no pages found, and then we end the nav link. We have those as H3s so that they're a little bigger. And other than that, there is a to be implemented login form button, which will bring up a modal with a login form within it, and you will be able to input an author ID and your email to access the sites which you yourself are creating. Now that we're done with page navbar, we'll go to page router. Page router is another class component. Call our constructor right up here with the onUpdate and the pages. Now is where the onUpdate is starting to get really important. We're going to pass that onUpdate into user page, and each route is going to be a different user page with the current page of page, and the path is that path which we specified earlier in page navbar. And then we key it to an index so that we can tell which page we're on when we're in that page. And then if there's no pages, we return a loading screen, and we then have a router and a routes, which is different from the start, which if I take a look at the notes that I have on React Router, that used to be switch and it got changed to routes in React Router v6, and then it maps each page to a new route. It does need a fallback route to what is essentially either a 404 or a home page, just to make sure that if that page is not found, it routes to a page not found page, rather than just saying, hey, what is going on? Let's now look down into our user page. As you can see, we're getting more and more fine, and now is when we actually start seeing the components here. We import just like usual, and now we have, I believe, our first functional component. I did a little refactor on this component halfway through, because I needed a specific piece of functionality for future updates, and that is I'm going to use ref to change how this behaves depending on where in the DOM and whose parent it is, or whose child it is. We have just our constants that we define up here, and then we have our view page method, which displays the actual page. We have a map function, a map method, and I will explain this method in a minute. That is actually its own component, built off to the side in components map over here. It is incredibly important, and the website breaks without that component. We return the current page components.length if it's greater than 0. So if we have pages, then we map the component and the index within the page components. We take inserted component and we find the component type within the components.map, the components.map component over here. We find the component type within that array. We set the inserted component equal to that string. It's very important that it's a string, because later, after we define the content of the component, we actually create the element that you see on screen. This was the most difficult portion of the assignment, as instead of being able to directly pass in, like so, you cannot do that. in React. React will not let you pass in a defined variable into the name of a component. So we have to create an element directly, and we have to use inserted component as the component type, and we set the content equal to content within the component. And then within the same row, we then add a user site editor with the onUpdate function and the current page slug. The current page slug needs to be on all of them, especially for the edit and delete, just to make sure it knows where it's trying to look. And then at the very bottom, if there is no pages, if there's no pages components, if nothing is there, we say content is site has no components, and then we render view page in its own container, and we add in a user site editor at the very bottom, and we have just ref of regular ref. That'll be default ref, basically, so it renders its default state. And current page slug and onUpdate are brought in as well. Let's go ahead, before we take a look at user site editor, let's go ahead and take a look at components map. All components map does as a component, it's a functional component which finds within this array what component is typed in within the user site editor's form, and as well as finds, when it's loading in, finds the string that is equal to the data that's in the API, converts it to a component tag, and just returns whatever that ends up being. This is really important. React can't take a string as a component type because of the quotation marks. The quotation marks will break the create element. So we had to map individually, and we could probably do this procedurally if we decided to add more elements and we ended up with this crazy long list, but since it's such a small amount of elements that we're needing to add, we can do this manually. We have to individually input each element with its corresponding text value in plain text. Let's now move on to our last stop, which is user site editor. It's not quite our last stop, but let's move on to user site editor. We import standard. We have a use imperative handle that'll be for future reference, as well as a use ref. That'll be when I implement the ability to change what I output from this component to its parent. And React 19 does a very good job at making refs extremely useful. And basically what refs are they are basically saying from a child you can reference a specific thing rather than referencing the whole child at once. So if the ref is equal to the used ref that's passed in, you can use that specific part of the child element in the parent. we have our input change handler, which takes the submission, and then switch cases the ID with the value that's inputted into the form at the bottom. And it's just switch cased because we can't use set state very easily if we don't have some sort of switch case, which allows us to check which input got changed. Then we have our submission handler, which prevents default to start, and then calls the new component smasher method. We'll move on to that now. It takes an index, which is passed in. It is not required. Add component at the regular add component, add new element. It does not pass in an index, so it just pushes it onto the end. It starts by the entirety of new component smasher just basically says, here is the component that we are going to create in JSON form. So the component type gets set to if component type is equal to nothing. We go ahead and set that to user title because it's the default. And if it's not equal to nothing, then we just set it to the component type. Content is equal to an object, and that's just the way that I have it set up in the API right now. In that content object, we have text, we have onClick, and we have href. Href is that link. Text is obviously text, and onClick is going to be the function that the button performs when you click on it. And then once it creates this added component, sends the added component into add component, the add component method, along with the index that was passed in originally. This is where that index gets important. Constant add component is the biggest method on this page, apart from the actual return statement, which returns our form. Add component is an asynchronous function that takes the component and the index. Index starts at null. If there is no index that's brought in, it just sets the index to null. We have a try and a catch statement, and the try sets user equal to get the current user, it would be, but right now we're just going with 0 for sake of getting this completed and getting this to a working CRUD operation. We have this set to 0 right now just to make sure it works. We then have an if statement where if the component exists and if the component's length is, or if the component doesn't exist or the component is exactly equal to 0 on its length, there is no new component. We return nothing. Otherwise, if there is the ability to add a component, we go ahead and constant a new current user is equal to the user spread, spread throughout an object. That basically just takes all the information from the API originally, which is from this get function, and puts it into current user. We have site pages, which just says, it just follows down the line in the API until we get to site pages. Page slugs is sitepages.map. It's each of the page slugs that is within that site, and we string them all to lowercase so that we can track which slug we're looking at, and we want to make sure that every slug is a lowercase. just to make sure that it matches up with how we are doing our slugging for the router and the navbar respectively. We then take our page index, so we take the index of the current page slug in page slugs, and we set that equal to the same style. So we toString and two lowercase it, so that it's the exact same style, so we can find exactly which string we need to find the index of the page. If the standard index, the index that we brought in, is null, this is the index of the actual element that's already on there. This is used for edit and delete. If there is no index, if there was no index passed in and it is still equal to null, we do current user dot site info dot site pages. We bring them down to site pages. We find the page index of that page. We look at the page components and we push the component to that page. If it is equal to an index, if there is an index, it has value, we find site pages, we find the page index, we go down to page components, and then we find the index of page component, and we set that to the new component. So we set the index of the page component to whatever the new component is supposed to say. That's when we edit the component. We then have a put, which puts the new current user into the protocol manager, and we pass that into our API, and we await non-update, which should, it is not doing it right now, but it should refresh the DOM rather than the page. We then set all the new portions of the state back to nothing, and these are all held they're all held within each of these forms. Very useful for if you want to track here, but you also want to be able to track what's going on here. You see, those are different. Now we'll move on to filter component, which filter component takes an index, and what it does is it splices out the component at index. That's the delete button. When it's submitted, we get the user data. We find the page the same way we do in add component. We could probably put this into a separate component. That is for a future refactor, just to make it a lot cleaner. Or we could put it into its own function within user editor, depending on if we needed it outside of user editor or not. But then we find the page index of the site pages of the user. We find the page components, and we splice at the index, and we splice at a width of 1. So we delete that. We delete that element like that. This use imperative handle ref, not useful yet, is not functional. This edit selected elements is not functional because we don't need it. It is already performed within add component with this this if else switch. And then we have our return at the bottom, which returns our form. We have our unsubmit, which just goes to our submission handler. We have our component type form. We have our text form. We have our href form, and we have our onClick form. And then we have our submit button. We have our submit button, which takes an index. The difference between these two is this one just adds a new element. This one takes the index as well and edits that selected element. And then the button at the bottom is an onClick, which does the filter function. That's our delete button. And then we export this functional component as user site editor. Let's go ahead and look at, last but not least, the different components that we're actually rendering for the elements on the page. We have our user site button, which is a regular class component. We have a nothing to report function, which basically just says if there is nothing, we are going to say there is nothing. And we're going to specify like where there is nothing. In our render function for the button, we have our constants that we go ahead and put in here for onClick, text, and href. We then return a new button which has an onClick of, if it has an onClick, then it has the onClick value. If it does not, then it just says nothing to report at onClick. It's the same with href. If it has a value at href, it puts in the href, but if it doesn't, it says nothing to report at href. And text is just the actual content of the button, and if it does not have text, then it just says this button has no text. We then move on to user site image, and all image does right now is it takes the href that's passed in and it puts it in the source and displays the image. We go on to user site text. It's just a paragraph that puts it literally just says text. And if it's empty, it just says empty text component, and component has no content is console.logged. Then we last but not least have user site title, which is just an h1 with either the text content or no title. Last, we are going to move on to our actual API that we're using right now. We have a mock API going. And mock API only tracks by ID for its endpoints. That's the lowest it'll go. You cannot change where it tracks, at least as far as I'm aware. So I have ID of 0. Author ID will basically be the quote password of the site that's being used, and then we'll have the first name, which is displayed on the page, the email, which is used to sign in, and then we'll have the site info. This is where we start getting to the actual nitty-gritty of the API. We have the site name, which will be displayed instead of React app. It'll be Build It Bootstrap or whatever your site name is. Down here, I have a future example, Sophie Dickens, that is me. And then we have the site brand, which is the logo for Bootstrap. That is fully owned by Bootstrap, and they request that whenever referring to Bootstrap, you use its full name and its exact logo with no changes. So that is what I'm doing here. We then have site pages, which is an array of all of our pages on that site. We have the first page, which is our page slug of home. As you can see, it's lowercase. We have our page name, which is going to be capital home. That'll be what's actually showing for the name of the page when I update that. We then move into our page components, which is another array with component objects in it. our first object is component user site title with the content of text equals home. So that's just basically saying home is our title. And then we have another component separated by commas because JSON. We have another component which has a component type of user site text and content of text with our little about us text. That's our little welcome kind of toast. And then we have our second page, which is the only other page that we have on the site right now, and that is a page slug of about, a page name of about, a page components. It contains two components right now. It is a user site image with an href of it is an image of me. It's taken directly off of my LinkedIn media because might as well steal my own image from LinkedIn. That is my face after all, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem to use it. And then we have our second element, which is a link button with an href directly to the React Bootstrap documentation. Has text of React Bootstrap button docs. Does not have an on-click yet. And then we end our first ID. That is the API. That is the React Build It Bootstrap application as it stands right now. I am Sophie Dickens. Thank you very much for paying attention through all 52 minutes of this video. And I hope to see you around for future, hopefully slightly more frequent and slightly less feature-packed update videos, just so that they aren't 53 minutes long. You can find all of my Build It Bootstrap code on github.com/voidifperceived/builditbootstrap. And comment if you have any questions. Like the video if you like it. Subscribe if you would like. And I hope to see you around for future videos. Bye-bye.